They came to a beach on the far side of the island. It was small and made of white and brown rocks rather than sand. The waves rolled through them and they clacked together enjoyably. Easy, men, Lucy said, scanning the beach. There's something foul afoot. We're not all men, Talia said with a scowl. Girls can be explorers too, like Gertrude Bell. And Isabella Bird, Fee said. And Mary Kingsley. And Ida Laura Pfeiffer. And Robin. Okay, Lucy grumbled. I get it. Girls can do everything boys can. Geesh. He looked back at Linus, the devilish smile on his face. Do you like girls, Mr. Baker? Or boys? Or both? The children turned their heads slowly to stare at him. I like everyone, Linus managed to say. Boring, Talia muttered. I'm a boy, Chauncey exclaimed. He frowned. I think. You are whoever you want to be, Arthur told him, patting him between the eyes. Can we please get back to the task at hand? Lucy pleaded. You're going to get us all viciously murdered if we keep talking. Sal looked around nervously. Theodore perched on his shoulder, tail wrapped around his neck loosely. By who? I don't know, Lucy said, turning back to the beach. But as I was saying, there is something foul afoot. I can smell it. All the children sniffed the air. Even Theodore craned his neck, nostrils flaring. The only thing that smells foul here is Mr. Baker, Fee said, because he's sweating a lot. I'm not used to so much exertion, Linus snapped. Yeah, Talia said, it's not his fault he's round. Right, Mr. Baker? Us round people need to stick together. That didn't make Linus feel any better, but he said, exactly. Talia preened. Lucy rolled his eyes. It's not something you can smell. Only I can, because I'm the leader. It's coming from over there. He pointed toward a copse of trees just off the beach. It looked dark and foreboding. What is it, Lucy? Chauncey asked. Is it the cannibals? He didn't sound very enthused at the prospect. Probably, Lucy said. They could be cooking someone as we speak, so we should definitely go over there and check it out. I've always wanted to see what a person looked like while being cooked. Or maybe we can stay here, Talia said, reaching up and taking Linus's hand. He stared down at her, but didn't try and pull away. That might be for the best. Lucy shook his head. Explorers don't back down, especially the lady explorers. He's right, Fee said grimly, even if they are cannibals. Theodore whined and tucked his head under his wing. Sal reached up and stroked his tail. Bravery is a virtue, Arthur said. In the face of adversity, it separates the strong from the weak. Or the stupid from the smart, Talia muttered, squeezing Linus's hand. Boys are dumb. Linus couldn't help but agree, though he kept it to himself. Lucy puffed out his chest. I'm brave, and since I'm the leader, my brave order will be that Arthur goes first to make sure it's safe while the rest of us wait right here. Everybody nodded, including Linus. Arthur arched an eyebrow at him. He has a point, Linus said. Bravery is a virtue and all that. Arthur's lips twitched. If I must. You must, Lucy told him, and if there are cannibals, yell back at us when they start to eat you so we may know to run away. What if they eat my mouth first? Lucy squinted up at him. Try not to let that happen. Arthur squared his shoulders. He pulled out his machete and hopped up onto a large boulder, waves crashing around him. He made for a dashing figure, like a hero of old. He pointed the machete toward the copse of trees. For the expedition, he cried. For the expedition, the children shouted in response. Arthur winked at Linus, jumped down from the boulder, and ran for the trees. The shadows swallowed him whole, and then he was gone. They waited. Nothing happened. They waited a little longer. Still nothing. Uh-oh, Talia whispered. I think they probably started with his mouth. Should we go back? Chauncey warbled, eyes bouncing. I don't know, Lucy said. He looked up at Linus. I'm glad you're here. Linus was touched. Thank you, Lucy. If the cannibals start chasing after us, they'll see you first. We're little, and you've got all that meat on your bones, so it'll give us time to get away. Your forthcoming sacrifice is appreciated. Linus sighed. What should we do? Fee asked worriedly. I think we should go in after him, Sal said. They all looked at him. He met Linus's gaze for a moment before looking away. His mouth twisted down. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He would come for us. Theodore chirped, pressing his snout against Sal's ear. He's right, Lucy said. Arthur would come after us. I'm making a decision. We shall go after Arthur, and Mr. Baker will go first. You know, for a leader, you seem to delegate more than actually lead, Linus said dryly. Lucy shrugged. I'm 6 years old. Well, this body is. Mostly I'm ancient. But that's neither here nor there. Linus felt the ground sway beneath his feet slightly, but he managed to stave it off. If you insist. I do, Lucy said, sounding relieved. So much insisting. Talia let go of his hand and waddled behind Linus, beginning to push on the backs of his legs. Go, 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 go! Arthur could be getting eaten right this second, and you're just standing there. Linus sighed again. I'm going. It was ridiculous, of course. There were no cannibals on the island. It was just a story Lucy had made up. It wasn't even a very good story. But that didn't stop Linus from sweating profusely as he walked across the beach toward the trees. They were of a different sort than in the forest they'd walked through. They appeared far older and denser, and even though there were no cannibals, Linus could see why they would choose this copse if they did exist. It looked like the perfect place to consume human flesh. The bravery of the children was unmatched. They followed him, but at a good 15 paces behind him, all huddled together, eyes wide. Linus absolutely did not feel fond at the sight of them. He turned back toward the trees. Hello, Arthur, he called out. Are you in there? There was no response. Linus frowned. Surely this was a game that Arthur was taking too seriously. He called out again. Nothing. Uh-oh, he heard Lucy say behind him. He's probably been quartered already. What's that mean? Chauncey asked. He's getting paid? I like quarters. It means getting chopped up, Talia said. Into pieces. Ooh, Chauncey said. I don't like that at all. This was stupid. There were no cannibals. Linus stepped up to the trees, took a deep breath, and crossed into the forest. It was cooler inside the tree line, cooler than it should have been in the shadows. The humidity seemed to have faded away, and Linus actually shivered. There was a thin path ahead, winding its way through the trees. It didn't look as if anything had been hacked, either Vines or Arthur. Linus took that as a good sign. He walked farther, only pausing to look back over his shoulder once more. The children stood at the entrance to the copse, apparently having decided they could go no farther. Fee gave him a thumbs up. Lucy said, You're not dead. He sounded strangely disappointed. Leaders give positive reinforcement, Talia told him. Oh, good job not dying. That was better, Talia said. Chauncey's stalks lowered until his eyes were sitting on top of his body. I don't like this. Come on, Sal said as Theodore nibbled on his ear. We all go together. He took a step into the trees and the children followed, huddled around him. It caused Linus's heart to ache sweetly. He turned back around, schooling his face. What was wrong with him? This wasn't supposed to be this way. He wasn't supposed to. The path was suddenly blocked by a large tree sprouting in front of him with a roar, dirt spraying up in a large plume. Linus yelped as he stumbled back. The children screamed. A voice rang out, echoing around them as the tree groaned. Who dares to step inside my woods? Linus recognized it as Zoe almost immediately. He sighed. He was going to have so many words with her and Arthur later. The children rushed ahead and stood around Linus, looking up at him with wide eyes. Who is it? Lucy whispered furiously. Is it the cannibals? I don't know, Linus said. Could be. And while I might be a complete meal, they could be full after consuming Arthur and are only interested in something a little more snack-sized. Talia gasped. But I'm snack-sized. We all are, Fee moaned. Oh no, Chauncey said, trying to move between Linus's legs with varying degrees of success. Sal was looking at the trees around them, eyes narrowed. Theodore had shoved his head inside Sal's shirt. We need to be brave, Sal said. He's right, Lucy said, stepping so he stood next to Sal, the bravest. I'm just going to be brave right here, Chauncey said from underneath Linus. I should have brought my shovel, Talia muttered. I could have smashed the stupid cannibals in the head. What should we do? Fee asked. Should we charge? Lucy shook his head before bellowing, I demand to know who resides here. Zoe's voice was deep, but Linus could hear the smirk. Who are you to demand anything of me, child? I am the Commander Lucy, the leader of this expedition. Reveal yourself, and I promise to cause you no harm. Though, if you attack and are still hungry, Mr. Baker here has offered to sacrifice himself so that we may live. I offered no such thing. The Commander Lucy? Zoe asked, words echoing around them. Oh my, I've heard of you. Lucy blinked. You have? Yes, indeed. You're famous. I am? I am. That's me, the famous Commander Lucy. What is it you seek from me, Commander Lucy? He looked back at the others. Treasure, Fee decided. And Arthur, Chauncey said. What if we can only pick one? Talia asked. She was holding Linus's hand again. We pick Arthur, Sal said, sounding more sure of himself than Linus had ever heard him. Oh, really? Lucy said, kicking the dirt. But treasure, Sal insisted, and Theodore chirped his agreement from underneath Sal's chirp. When Linus had begun to understand these chirps, he didn't know. Lucy sighed. Fine, he turned back around. We seek Arthur Parnassus. Is that it? Zoe asked, voice booming. Well, I wouldn't say no to treasure. Lucy, Chauncey hissed. Lucy groaned. Just Arthur. Then so be it. The tree shrank back down into the ground in a flash. The pathway was clear. Would you like to lead the way, Commander Lucy? Linus asked. Lucy shook his head. You were doing such a good job of it, and you look like you don't hear that often enough. I don't want to take that away from you. Lucy prayed for strength. Linus prayed for strength as he led the way. Talia still holding his hand. The other children gathered behind them, with Sal and Theodore bringing up the rear. They didn't have to travel far. Soon the path led to a small clearing, and in this clearing sat a house. It was a single level, made of wood and covered with ivy. It looked ancient, grass growing thickly at its base. The door was open. Linus thought of the stories from his youth, of witches luring children inside, but the witches he knew weren't cannibals. Well, mostly. It struck him then just who this house belonged to, and how much of an honor this would be. For an adult sprite, their dwelling was their most important possession. It was their home where all their secrets were kept. Sprites were notorious for their privacy, and he had no doubt that Fee would one day be the same, though he hoped she would remember the time spent at Marsyas in her youth. She wouldn't have to be so alone. The fact that Zoe Chapelwhite was inviting them in was not lost on Linus. He wondered if Arthur had been there before. Linus thought he had. And why Zoe had allowed Linus on her island to begin with, and who the orphanage house belonged to. All questions he didn't have the answers to. Was it his place to ask? He wasn't sure. It didn't have any bearing on the children, did it? Whoa, Lucy breathed. Look at that. Flowers were beginning to bloom along the vines amongst the ivy. It looked as if they were growing from the house itself. Bright colors, pink and gold and red and blue, like the sky and ocean, raced along vines. It took only moments for the entire house to be covered in them, even stretching up and over the roof. Fee sighed dreamily. So pretty. Linus couldn't help agreeing. He'd never seen anything like it. He thought how muted his sunflowers must seem in comparison. He didn't know how he'd ever thought they were so bright. They were bright. Going home was going to be quite the shock. A figure appeared in the doorway. The children moved closer to Linus. Zoe stepped into the sunlight. She wore a white dress that contrasted beautifully with her dark skin. The flowers in her hair matched the ones that grew along her house. Her wings were spread wide. She smiled at them. Explorers, I'm pleased to see you found your way. I knew it, Lucy crowed, throwing his hands up. There were no cannibals. It was Zoe the whole time. He shook his head. I wasn't scared, but everyone else was. Big babies. The other children, it would seem, disagreed with this vehemently, if their indignant cries were any indication. Is Arthur alive? Chauncey asked. Nobody ate him or anything? Nobody ate him, Zoe said. She stepped out of the doorway. He's inside, waiting for all of you. Perhaps there is lunch, maybe even a pie, but you'll have to find out for yourself. Any lingering fear they might have had apparently disappeared immediately with the promise of food, as they all charged through the doorway, even Sal. Theodore squawked, but managed to hold on to the bigger boy. Linus stayed right where he was, unsure of what he should do next. Zoe had offered an invitation, but it had been to the children. He didn't know if that extended to him. Zoe pushed away from the house. With every step she took, the grass grew under her feet. She stopped in front of him, eyeing him curiously. "Zoe?" he said with a nod. She was amused. "Linus, I heard you had quite the adventure." "Indeed, a bit out of my comfort zone. I expect that's how most explorers feel when they step out of the only world they know for the first time." "You often say one thing while meaning another, don't you?" She grinned. "I have no idea what you're talking about." He didn't believe her at all. "Arthur all right?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Arthur is fine." Linus nodded slowly. "Because he's been here before, I take it?" "Is there a question you'd like to ask, Linus?" There were so many. "No, just making conversation." "You're not very good at it." "That's not the first time I've heard that, if I'm being honest." Her expression softened. "No, I don't believe it is. Yes, he's been here before. But not the children." She shook her head. "No, this is the first time." "Why now?" She stared at him, eyes alight with something he couldn't quite place. "This island is theirs just as much as it's mine. It was time." He frowned. "Not for my benefit, I hope." "No, Linus, not for your benefit. It would have happened whether you were here or not. Would you like to come inside?" He tried to cover his surprise, but failed miserably. "This island isn't mine." She hesitated. "No, but I wouldn't leave you out here by yourself. There might be cannibals after all." "Could be," he agreed. "Then, thank you." "For?" He wasn't quite sure. "Most things, I suspect." "That's all encompassing. I find it best to be that way, lest I forget one thing in particular." She laughed. The flowers along her hair and house grew brighter with the sound. "You're very dear, Linus Baker. There's a surface to you that's hard but cracked. Dig a little deeper, and there is all this life teeming wildly. It's a conundrum." He flushed. "I don't know about all that." "I heard you philosophized in the woods. I think Arthur rather enjoyed himself." Linus began to sputter. "It's not, I suppose, it wasn't anything much." "I think it was quite a lot, actually." And with that, she turned and headed inside the house, leaving Linus to stare after her. The interior of the house appeared to be an extension of what could be found outside. Instead of a floor, there was exposed earth, the grass forming a thick carpet. Pots filled with flowers hung from the ceiling. Tiny blue crabs and snails with shells of green and gold clung to the walls. The windows were open, and Linus could hear the ocean in the distance. It was a sound he had grown accustomed to. He would miss it when it was time for him to leave. Food had been spread out for them on a wooden counter. The children held what appeared to be large shells, stacking food high on them. There were sandwiches and potato salad and strawberries, so red Linus thought they had to be fake until Theodore bit into one, eyes rolling back in his head in ecstasy. Arthur Parnassus sat in an old chair, hands folded in his lap, as he watched with amusement as the children began to gorge themselves, even as Zoe warned them to slow down. Expeditions were hungry work. Linus's stomach was growling too. "I'm glad to see you survived," Linus said, shifting awkwardly as he stood next to the chair. Arthur tilted his head back to look up at him. "Quite brave of me, I know." Linus snorted. "Indeed, they'll write epic poems about you." "I should like that, I think." "Of course you would." The corners of Arthur's eyes crinkled. "Before they descended upon their bounty, I was told you were a good caretaker in my absence." Linus shook his head. "Lucy was probably having one over on you." "It came from Sal." Linus blinked. "Come again?" "Sal said you held Talia's hand without her needing to ask, and that you listened to all of them, letting them make their own decisions." Linus was flustered. "It wasn't, I was just going along." "Well, thank you regardless. As I'm sure you know, that's quite high praise coming from him. Linus did know. He's getting used to me, I guess. Arthur shook his head. It's not that. He sees things, perhaps more than the rest of us, the good in people, the bad. He's come across all kinds in his short life. He can see what others cannot. I'm just me, Linus said, unsure of where this was going. I don't know how to be anyone else but who I already am. That is how I've always been. It's not much, but I do the best I can with what I have. Arthur looked at him sadly. He reached out and squeezed Linus's hand briefly before letting go. I suppose the best is all one could ask for. He stood, smiling, though his smile wasn't as bright as it usually was. How is the bounty, explorers? Good, Chauncey said, swallowing an entire sandwich in one bite. It sank down inside of him and began to break apart. It would be better if there were actual treasure, Lucy muttered. And what if the treasure was the friendships we solidified along the way? Arthur asked. Lucy pulled a face. That's the worst treasure in the world. They already were my friends. I want rubies. Theodore perked up and chirped a question. No, Talia said through a mouthful of potato salad. Bits of egg and mustard dotted her beard. No rubies. His wings drooped. But there is pie, Zoe said, baked especially for you. Lucy sighed. If I must. You must, Arthur said, and I do believe you will enjoy it as much as any rubies. He glanced back at Linus. Are you hungry, dear explorer? Linus nodded and joined the others. It was in the din of food, Chauncey face down in his pie, and laughter, Chauncey spraying bits of pie when Lucy told a rather ribald joke that was highly inappropriate for someone his age, when Linus noticed Zoe and Fee slipping out the door. Arthur and the other children were distracted. Chauncey, Lucy cried happily, you got pie in my nose! And Linus felt the strange and sudden urge to see what the sprites were up to. He found them just inside the tree line, beyond the house. Zoe had her hand on Fee's shoulder, their wings glistening in the shafts of light that pierced the canopy. And what did you feel? Zoe was asking. They didn't glance in his direction, though he thought they knew he was there. The days where Linus could move quietly were far behind him. The earth, Fee said promptly, her hair like fire. The trees, their root system beneath the sand and dirt. It was like it was waiting for me, listening. Zoe looked pleased. Precisely. There is a world hidden underneath what we can see. Most won't understand it for what it is. We're lucky, I think. We can feel what others cannot. Fee looked off into the forest, her wings fluttering. I like the trees. Better than I like most people. Linus snorted, unable to stop himself. He tried to cover it up, but it was too late. They turned their heads to look at him slowly. Sorry, he said hastily. Sorry, I didn't mean, I shouldn't have interrupted. Something you'd like to say? Zoe asked, and though there was no heart to her words, it still felt pointed. He started to shake his head, but stopped himself. It's just that I have sunflowers at home in the city. He felt a sharp pang in his chest, but he rubbed it away. Gangly things that don't always do what I want them to, but I planted them myself and cared for them as they grew. I tend to like them more than I like most people. Fee narrowed her eyes. Sunflowers. Linus wiped his brow. Yes, they're not, well, they're nothing so grand as what's in Talia's garden, nor as the trees here, but it's a bit of color in all the gray of steel and rain. Fee considered him. And you like the color? I do, Linus said. It's something small, but I think the smaller things can be just as important. Everything has to start somewhere, Zoe said, patting the top of Fee's head, and as long as we nurture them, they can grow beyond anything we thought possible. Isn't that right, Linus? Of course, Linus said, knowing both of them would be listening to his every word. The least he could do was be truthful about it. I admit I miss them more than I expected to. It's funny, isn't it? No, Fee said. I would miss this place if I ever had to leave. Oh dear, that wasn't what he was going for. He'd stepped into it now. Yes, I see that. He looked up into the trees. Certainly has its charms, I'll give you that. Populus tremuloidus, Fee said. Linus squinted at her. I beg your pardon? Zoe covered up a laugh with the back of her hand. Populus tremuloidus, Fee said again. I read about them in a book. Quaking aspens. If you ever see them, you'll find them in large groves. Their trunks are mostly white, but their leaves are a brilliant shade of yellow, almost gold, like the sun. She looked off into the forest again, almost like sunflowers. They sound lovely, Linus said, unsure of what else to say. They are, Fee said. But it's what's underneath that's most important. The groves can make up thousands of trees, sometimes even the tens of thousands. Each of them is different, but the secret is that they're all the same. Linus blinked. How so? Fee crouched down to the ground, her fingers leaving trails in the loose soil. They're clones of each other, a single organism managed by an extensive root system underneath the earth. All the trees are genetically the same, though they each have their own personality, as trees often do. But before they grow, their roots can lay dormant for decades, waiting until the conditions are right. It simply takes time. There's one clone that's said to be almost 80,000 years old and is possibly the oldest living organism in existence. Linus nodded slowly. I see. Do you? Fee asked. Because even if you wiped out the grove, if you tear down all the trees, unless you get to the roots, they'll just be reborn again and grow as they had before. Maybe not quite the same, but eventually their trunks will be white and their leaves will turn gold. I would like to see them one day. I think they'd have much to tell me. They would, Zoe said, more than you can even possibly know. They have a long, long memory. Have you seen them? Linus asked. Perhaps. Sprites, Linus muttered to himself. Then, if they're all the same, how can you tell them apart? You have to see what's underneath it all, Fee said. She dug her hands into the earth. You have to put in the time to learn what the differences are. It's slow going, but that's what patience is for. The roots can go on forever waiting for the right time. She frowned at the ground. I wonder if I can... Linus took a step forward when she grunted as if wounded. Zoe shook her head in warning, and he stopped in his tracks. There was a subtle shift in the air, as if it had become slightly heavier. Fee's wings began to flutter rapidly, lights refracting off them in little rainbows. She pushed her hands into the soil until they were covered completely. Sweat dripped from the tip of her nose onto the ground. Her brow furrowed. She sighed as she pulled her hands from the ground. Linus was speechless when a green stalk grew from the earth. Leaves unfurled long and thin. The stalks swayed back and forth underneath Fee's palms, her fingers twitching. He was stunned when a yellow flower bloomed, the petals bright. It grew a few more inches before Fee lowered her hands. It's not a sunflower, she said quietly. I don't think they'd survive here for long, even with the best of intentions. It's called a bush daisy. Linus struggled to find his voice. Did you just grow that? She shuffled her bare feet. It isn't much, I know. Talia's better with the flowers. I prefer trees. They live longer. Isn't much, Linus said incredulously. Fee, it's wonderful. She looked startled as she glanced between Linus and Zoe. It is? He rushed forward, crouching down near the flower. His hand was shaking when he reached out to touch it gently, half convinced it wasn't real, just a trick of the eye. He gasped quietly when he rubbed the silky smooth petal between his fingers. It was such a little thing, yet it was there, when only moments before there had been nothing at all. He looked up at Fee, who was staring down at him, gnawing on her bottom lip. It is, he said firmly. Absolutely beautiful. I've never seen such a thing. Why, I'd even say it's better than the sunflowers. Well, let's not go that far, Fee grumbled, though it looked as if she were fighting a smile. How did you do it? He asked, the petal still beneath his fingers. She shrugged. I listened to the earth. It sings. Most people don't realize it. You have to listen for it with all your might. Some will never hear it, no matter how hard they try, but I can hear it as well as I can hear you. It sang to me, and I promised it in return that I would care for it if it should give me what I asked for. She glanced down at the flower. Do you really like it? Yes, Linus whispered, very much. She grinned at him. Good. You know, You should know I've named it Linus. You should feel honored. I am, Linus said, absurdly touched. It's a perfect name for it, she continued. It's a little flimsy and honestly isn't much to look at, and will probably die if someone doesn't take care of it regularly. Linus sighed. Ah, I see. Good, she said, her smile widening. She sobered slightly as she looked down at the flower. But it's still nice, if you think about it. It wasn't there, and now it is. That's all that really matters in the long run. You can make something out of nothing, Linus said. That's impressive. Not something out of nothing, she said, not unkindly. It was just hidden away. I knew what to look for because I listened for it. As long as you listen, you can hear all manner of things you never thought were there to begin with. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go put so much pie in my mouth, I'll probably choke, and then I'll eat some more. I swear, if Lucy didn't leave any for me, I'm going to grow a tree out of his ears. And with that, she headed toward the small house, wings fluttering behind her. Linus stared after her. That was an effective threat. Zoe laughed. It was, wasn't it? She's capable. They all are, if only one can see past the flourish above to the roots. A little on the nose, that, he said. I suppose it is, Zoe said, but something tells me that subtlety is lost on you. She turned toward the house, stepping into Fee's footprints in the soil. Coming, Linus? I do believe you deserve another piece of pie after your lesson. In a moment, he said. He looked to the flower again as Zoe went inside. He pressed a finger against the center as lightly as he could. He pulled it away. The tip yellowed with pollen. Without thinking, he stuck his finger against his tongue. The pollen was wild and bitter and oh so alive. He closed his eyes and breathed. Chapter 11. Department in charge of magical youth, case report number 2, Marsyas Orphanage, Linus Baker, caseworker BY78941. I solemnly swear the contents of this report are accurate and true. I understand per dichotomy guidelines that any discoverable falsehoods will result in censure and could lead to termination. My second week at the Marsyas Orphanage has brought new insights into its inhabitants. Where once there seemed to be chaos, I now see a strange yet definitive order. It has nothing to do with hastily brought changes at my arrival, of which I assume there were a few. Such things usually occur before a caseworker walks through the door, but more so with me growing accustomed to how things are run. Miss Chapelwhite, though she isn't on any kind of dichotomy payroll, cares for these children as if they were her own. Given that she's a sprite, it's a little surprising, as her kind are known for their solitary existences and being extraordinarily protective of the lands that they tend to. In fact, I don't know that I've ever met a sprite who wasn't fiercely protective of their privacy. And while Miss Chapelwhite isn't exactly forthcoming, she does work in tandem with the master of the house to ensure that children are well provided for. She is often found in the kitchen preparing meals and even takes to handling study groups for the lessons Mr. Parnassus has taught. She is well versed on a variety of subjects, and her tutelage enhances what the children have learned. It appears to be free of any sort of propaganda, though that might be for my benefit. I've now seen Lucy's room and sat in on one of his sessions with Mr. Parnassus. If you take away what is known about the boy, who he is supposed to be, you are left with an inquisitive youth who tends to say things for shock value rather than with any sincerity. He is intelligent, almost frighteningly so, and well-spoken. If Dichotomy weren't sure he was the Antichrist, a word that's not to be uttered at the Marsyas Orphanage, I would think he was nothing more than a boy capable of conjuring images meant to scare. However, I expect this is what he wants me to think. I would do well to keep my guard up. Just because he appears as a child doesn't mean he isn't capable of great calamity. His room is small, converted from a walk-in closet in Mr. Parnassus's own room. He was somewhat shy in showing me where he resides, but his love for music allowed me to form a connection with him. I believe, under proper guidance, that he will be capable of becoming a productive member of society, so long, that is, as he doesn't give in to his true nature. It does beg the question of nature versus nurture. If there is inherent evil in the world that can be overcome by a normalized upbringing, can he be rehabilitated, assimilated? That remains to be seen. I haven't seen Sal's room, though I think I am slowly gaining his trust. I have to be careful with him. He reminds me of a skittish foal. That being said, I have heard him speak more in the last day than I have in the entirety of my stay on the island thus far. Granted, he wasn't speaking to me, but around me. But I don't know that it matters. He's like a sunflower, I think. He needs to be coaxed with proper care to show his true colors. Theodore, the wyvern, has a hoard that I haven't seen yet, though it has to be filled with at least a dozen of my buttons. I may not ever see it, but as of yet, it doesn't cause me any great concern. They're only buttons, after all. I plan on keeping a sharp eye out in case there are hints at anything more nefarious. The biggest issue I see to date is what appears to be isolation. The children don't leave the island, large as it is. There is a reason for it, and one I am bothered by. It would have been helpful to know before my arrival that the villagers are paid by the government for their silence. Little details like this are important, and the fact that I was unaware makes me look unprofessional. It does raise the question, too, of the source of these payments. Do they come from the funding that's earmarked for this specific orphanage? I would expect an auditor would take issue if that's the case. The village nearby seems to be somewhat hostile to the inhabitants of the orphanage. I believe Dicomie isn't doing itself any favors with its campaign in conjunction with the department in charge of registration. There are signs of "see something, say something" in every corner of the village, and it's reminiscent of those in the city, though they seem more cluttered here. If the children don't feel welcome in the real world, how can we ever hope to integrate them into society? I'm thinking of a day trip, perhaps, to test the waters. I'll need to bring it up to Mr. Parnassus, of course. I think it would do the children good and hopefully allow the villagers to see their fears are unfounded. If Arthur says no, I suppose I'll have to abide by it. Such a strange fellow Arthur is. He cares for the children. That much is clear. While he doesn't follow rules and regulations to the letter, possibly not at all, I think there is merit to what he does. The children all care about each other immensely, and I believe that it is no small part due to Arthur. Still, he is an enigma. For all that I've learned about this place, I feel as if I know him the least. I will need to rectify that, I think. For the children, of course. Talia showed me more of the garden today. Gnomes are quite proficient in horticulture, but she seems to outshine even the very best. And it was Tuesday in Linus's second week on Marsyas when Calliope decided she needed to be chased after committing theft. It certainly wasn't something Linus wanted to do. It was after lunch, and he was sitting on the porch in the sun, dozing quite peacefully. He still had a few moments before he needed to return to the main house to sit in on the children's studies, and he was using that time wisely. And then there was the idea of chasing a cat at all. Linus, for all that he was capable of, didn't like to chase anything. Chasing implied running, and Linus had decided long ago that running wasn't something he liked very much. He never understood those who woke up even before the sun had risen, donned their fancy, expensive sneakers, and went running on purpose. It was most unusual. But then Calliope burst out of the guest home, hackles raised and eyes wide, as felines sometimes did for mysterious reasons. She looked at him wildly, tail up in a rigid line, claws digging into the floorboards, and she had one of his ties in her mouth. Linus frowned. "What are you?" Calliope bolted off the porch toward the garden. Linus almost toppled over as he stood from his chair, managing to stay upright by the grace of God. He watched as Calliope ran, the black tie trailing behind her. "Hey!" he shouted. "Damn cat! What are you doing? Stop this instant!" She didn't stop. She disappeared behind a hedge. For a moment, Linus thought about letting her go. It was just a tie, after all. He actually hadn't worn a tie this week. It was much too warm, and Fee had asked why he always wore one. When he told her it was proper for someone in his position to wear a tie, she'd stared at him before walking away, shaking her head. But it absolutely wasn't because of Fee that he'd foregone his tie on Sunday for the first time. And then when Monday had come around again, he decided it certainly wasn't necessary, at least for the time being. Once he returned to the city, he'd have to wear one, of course, but now? It wasn't like he was being supervised. Who would know? Fee did, apparently, if her smirk was any indication. But still, that tie had cost him more than he cared to think about, and just because he wasn't wearing it now didn't give Calliope the right to take it from him. He'd need it when he went back home, and so he chased after his cat. He was sweating by the time he made it to the garden. A man of his size and shape meeting with wind resistance made running that much more difficult. And sure, maybe he wasn't running exactly, but jogging was just as bad. He entered the garden, calling after Calliope, demanding that she show herself. She didn't, of course, because she was a cat and therefore didn't listen to anything anyone told her. He looked under hedges and in flower beds, sure he'd find her crouching tail, twitching as she gnawed on his tie. I don't know why island life has made you this way, he said loudly as he pushed himself up from the ground, but I promise you things will change when we get back home. This is unacceptable. He made his way farther into the garden, reaching a part he hadn't yet seen before. It wrapped around the side of the house and was much denser than what Talia had shown him so far. Here the flowers looked wilder, their blooms bright, almost shocking. The sea was on the other side of the house, and the shadows were plentiful. There were many places for a cat to hide. He stepped around an old tree, the limbs gnarled, the leaves folded, and saw, "There you are," he said with a sigh. "What on earth has gotten into you?" Calliope sat on her haunches, tie lying on the ground at her feet. She looked up at him with knowing eyes. She meowed again, a sound he still wasn't used to. "I don't care," he replied. "You can't steal my things. It's impolite, and I don't like having to chase after you." He blinked. There, behind Calliope, was what appeared to be a cellar door at the base of the house. The foundation was made of stone, and the doors were thick and wooden. He stepped forward with a frown, seeing what appeared to be scorch marks upon the doors, as if there had been a fire behind them once upon a time. He thought for a moment, trying to remember if he'd ever been told there was a basement to the house. He didn't think he had, and aside from Sal's room, he'd seen what he thought was almost every inch of the house. If this was a basement, there was no entrance to it inside. There was a rusted padlock on the door. Whatever was down there, if anything at all, would remain hidden. For a moment, Linus thought about getting one of Talia's shovels and using it to pry open the door, but dismissed it immediately. It was locked for a reason, most likely to keep the children out. If there had once been a fire down there, it was unsafe. Arthur had probably put the padlock there himself. It didn't look as if anyone had been there in ages. The path to the cellar door was overgrown with weeds, which seemed at odds with the rest of Talia's garden. "Most likely a coal cellar," Linus muttered, would explain the scorching. And since coal isn't used as much anymore, better to be safe than sorry. He bent down and scooped up his tie. Calliope watched him with bright eyes. "This is mine," he told her. "Stealing is wrong." She licked her paw and rubbed it over her face. Yes, well, regardless. He glanced once more at the cellar door before turning back the way he'd come. He would have to remember to ask Arthur about the cellar door when they had a moment alone.